They say if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything at all. It could be a very quiet edition of Inside the Zone with Blake Sebring. Not the best week.
Let's talk about Carolyn's NCAA picks.
All right. Yeah. Hey, my daughter doing pretty well. She still has Michigan alive and Oregon alive. Actually, she's looking a lot better than I am. And a lot better than the Komets because things started off pretty rough this week. On Wednesday, had a chance to keep their playoff hopes alive. It didn't happen. They lose 8-2 at home.
8-2, nothing, pretty much. I mean, that was a wild game. I don't think I've ever seen one of those. I mean, I've seen some really bad ones. I remember them getting beat by Flint, was it 9-3 one night, but 8-0. I don't know that I've seen that one.
Yeah, and because of the tiebreaker with Toledo, they were eliminated with a loss and a Toledo win and some other statistics. But the statistic that jumps out to me, 6 goals allowed in the first period. When you're fighting for your playoff life, I mean, that doesn't it show that you've given up?
And look where the shots were from. I mean, Jeff Delorier could sue for non-support. I mean, they were all mid-low slot, you know.
Point blank.
Sometimes there was a guy in front of him, sometimes there wasn't. And if he was in front of him, he was screening him, you know. I mean, it was just amazing. That one power play goal was tic-tac-toe, bang, it was in by the time you could say it, you know.
And unfortunately, it was a trend that continued because on Friday, they gave up 5 goals in the first period. So they gave up 11 goals in the first period in 2 games combined. Does that I don't know what you say if you're Al Sims, because that's just showing maybe a lack of effort, a lack of hustle. I know they were playing a pretty good team in Reading on Wednesday.
And Elmira's playing well right now, too.
Right.
But I don't know. I mean, I don't know what you say. I mean, it's just a colossal failure of everything. You know, you give them credit for tightening up a little bit and playing well the next 2 periods, but it's like, okay, but what about the first one? You can't make up for that. I mean, you can't excuse that. It's just ridiculous. I think that just shows you how inconsistent everything has become this last 20 games. I mean, effort, the power play isn't there, the penalty killing isn't there. Are you a defensive team? Are you an offensive team? They're just all trying to figure it out still, and that's not a good thing.
Speaking of being consistently inconsistent, then they come back against, you mentioned, a good Elmira team, and they lose in a shootout. Played pretty well.
Charlie
2-1.
stops a penalty shot in the overtime. I can't remember the last time there was a penalty shot in the overtime of a regular season game. I can remember exactly for a playoff game. It was at Muskegon, but I can't remember for a regular season game having an overtime playoff penalty shot.
Yeah, so 3 games this week. That will end the season. Starting with a game on Wednesday night at home, what do they need to do to finish out the season and kind of wash the bad taste from last week out of the mouth and at least end on a positive to give them some momentum rolling over into the next year?
Well, I'm not sure anything they can do can give momentum in the next year because there's going to be such massive wholesale changes. You know what would be nice? It would be really nice to win the final 3 games and finish above 500. I think that would be quite an accomplishment after everything they've been through. To be able to do that, that would be really something. Other than that, you can't finish above 500 at home. You can't, you know, you really doesn't matter if you improve your position or anything. There's really no more individual statistics for anybody to go for yet. It would just be nice to see them win the final 3 games and finish above 500, which when you look back on it in 10 years will be quite an accomplishment after everything they've gone through.
And I think this week also gives you a chance to evaluate some of the players.
No, I think that's done.
Really? You think that's done?
I really think that's done. We asked Coach Sims about that a couple weeks ago, and he said that they'd pretty much done that already, which I'm sure didn't go over very well in the locker room.
I was going to say, that's not really good to cash in your chips that early.
But I think that's part of the reason we saw some of the things we saw recently, too. I think that's part of it.
Decisions on the future, certainly. It was interesting to see on Wednesday when the Komets released that Colin Chalk was on IR, essentially ending his season. He'd missed 3 games, I believe, before that. 44 games missed for the season. Pick a part of the body. It hasn't been healthy for Colin this year. But have we seen the last game with Colin Chalk in a Komet sweater?
I believe so. I don't know so. Just because Colin wants to coach so badly. And I think he's going to be a great coach. And I think he will get a job this summer coaching before he will, you know, I think he will get a job coaching this summer. Now, he can have playing as a fallback if his shoulder and everything gets healthy. I mean, right now the prognosis is just give it rest, and it will. But He hasn't so far, but he tried to come back and play when he obviously shouldn't have. But that was because he was Colin, and he wants to come back and try to help the team. And they desperately needed that help at that point. But I think Colin will get a coaching job somewhere this summer.
That to me begs the question, will it be with the Komets, and what's the situation with Al Sims? You know more than anybody perhaps the ins and outs of what the Komets do. What do you see as head coaching position for the Komets next year? Is Al back?
It would not shock me if Al was back. And I look at this in a completely different manner in the ECHL versus the CHL. The CHL, you were paid to win, period. The ECHL, you're paid to win and develop players. And with it being their first year in the ECHL, there was a huge adjustment for everybody. I think Al will coach in an entirely different style next year if he comes back, too. I think he will be much more demanding early of everyone. And he will try to force them to become a team, which never really happened this year. But, I mean, if you had a coach with a resume of 4 championships in 5 years apply for your spot, you'd pretty much hire him. So you got to look at that, too. You know, I mean, and I think Al will be much more fired up to coach next year, too. Now, he's got to decide, does he want to come in full bore, stay here all summer, and recruit, which he is not, that's not his favorite thing to do. But that's what this league is going to have to be. It's going to be all about recruiting and scouting from here on in. It's not going to be, well, we're going to go pick off certain players like they did last year in the CHL. That's not going to happen this time. It's just not going to work because you have to get bigger and faster. Well, how do you get bigger and faster? You can't do that by finding veteran players that way, because all the veteran players or players with any experience who are any good at that have those kind of skills. They're already signed by the AHL teams. Mm-hmm. So you're going to have to go get rookies, which means you got to go scout. You have to really trust your contacts that if this guy says this kid can play and he's 6'2", you got to take that chance. But you got to trust it. And I think you get a lot more into Canada with the rookies and such because of the immigration status, where you have to have the immigration papers with your team if it's a non-NHL or AHL affiliated player. I think because if you look at this year, the Komets brought back a lot of guys from training camp. Well, they were mostly American players. Well, I think you'll look at them to sign more Canadian players for next year and try to get bigger that way too. So you'll see a better depth at rookie for next year.
Yeah, certainly David Franke's got his work cut out for him. But we've seen him do work miracles in the past.
Well, the thing is
certainly
whenever they have a bad season like this, they're always like hyper aggressive to come back the next year.
Right.
And they have to be hyper aggressive off the ice and on the ice to start over, because you know they get this they have this little chip on their shoulder, which isn't little when they don't succeed. And nobody wants to win more than David Franke. I've never met a Komets fan or player who wants to win as much as he does. Never. I mean, he's just obsessed about it.
Yeah, and we can talk about what the Komets need to do in the offseason a little bit next week when we wrap up the season. But on Saturday, it'll be the final game of the year for the Komets. Traditionally, they hand out their postseason awards. And I know there are a lot of them, but I want to go through kind of the main 3 today. MVP, I think this is an easy choice. I want to see if
Brandon Marino. It's got to be. I mean, he's been the most consistent player offensively and with his effort the entire season from day one. He has been the guy. He's even when he was having trouble scoring, he was the one getting the most chances. I mean, because he would sacrifice his body and stick his nose in there and just keep going.
Yeah, I think that's a no-brainer. 71 points on the season. Brett Smith is second with 45, so it's not even close. Also,
now, if Kenny Ryder had been here all year, you could have made the argument for Kenny.
Or Maggio, or Josh Britton, actually.
Yes,
Britton was 13 goals in 31 games.
Yes.
So pretty big numbers, depending on. Lash was great. Caputi was good. So there are some. I see you biting your tongue, but statistically, there are things that bore themselves out. Rookie of the year.
I think it has to be Kenny Ryder, even though he's not here right now.
Mm-hmm.
When we look back on this season and however long, that's going to be what we remember is Kenny's play. And I think that is the defining part of this season for me was Kenny's play.
And you said, what was their record when Kenny was here?
When Kenny and Maggio got called up within 1 day of each other, the Komets were 5 games over 500 and in 6th place in the playoffs. After that, they're like 5 or 6 games under 500.
Yeah, it's hard to argue with those numbers. Those guys were huge.
Well, and it took a month to replace Kenny when they got Jeff Delorier, and they never did replace Maggio. And you can bring in Jamie Milam and some other guys. I mean, I'm not disputing them, but you can't ask them to be your number one defenseman. So, and then they finally were able to get Schaus and Gensel back a little bit toward the end. Mm-hmm. But you take out Maggio and Schaus, there's a number one defensive pairing. Nobody replaces that.
Right. This is the one that I'm intrigued to, because you see them every day. Mm-hmm. So I think you have a better gauge on this than almost anybody.
I don't know about that.
Most improved.
Oh, that's an easy one. It really is. That's Ryan Haggerty.
Okay.
And I'll tell you why. And I've told Ryan this, so I'm not speaking out of school. There have been some times this year, early in the year, where Ryan would struggle in a game and he would just never get it back. It was just, he was dog meat out there and he knew it. And he would accept it. And he, to his credit, never got his head down. And then there were games in the last month or so where he would start out struggling. And I'll be darned if by the end of the game, he didn't pick it up and he was right back to where he should have been. He could not have done that in the first half of the season as a pure rookie. And I give that kid a lot of credit. When everything else was falling apart around him, he still kept getting better.
What about, I agree, because there were some games where it looked like he didn't belong specifically in the first period, and then after that things were fine.
Yeah, and he would settle down. He would regroup and get his head back into it.
That's a pretty heady choice. What about Gates or Furman? Or Kishel even?
Or Wheeler.
Wheeler, good choice.
I mean, Wheeler was my unsung hero. Yeah. And I'll tell you why. It's because he never backed down from anybody who was bigger. He played both defenseman and forward, and sometimes in the same game. And he did it effectively and credibly. I give him amazing amounts of credit for that because that is incredibly hard to do. And I really thought that he earned a spot for himself. Maybe not on the roster, we'll see next year. But man, what a great guy to have as your 11th forward or your 7th defenseman who can play either, and you know what you're going to get out of him. You know the effort you're going to get out of him if you need to play him in, and you don't worry about it, and he can play with anybody. I think he really showed a lot this year.
A little bit of a Keith Rogers type in the fact that he can play up front and back?
I think Nick is better than Keith was at that. Keith was very one-dimensional. I mean, and I'm not knocking Keith at all. Keith, you'd say, go hit that guy. He'd go hit that guy 4 times in a row.
Yeah.
But you don't touch the puck. I mean, Keith was very willing that way. He would do exactly what you told him to. Nick actually has a little bit of skill and some speed, too, to create some things offensively. He was great on the forecheck, and he was very good defensively coming back.
But he doesn't name his stick after Storms.
No, he doesn't.
Which is unfortunate, because it's a great story. Google it if you get a chance. But don't forget to join us.
Look for Edna.
Yeah. Don't forget to join us next week where we put the entire wrap on the season and break down what the Komets need to do in the offseason to make their second year in the ECHL better than this past season.
And I don't think there's any doubt it will be, do you?
No, I don't think so. You can't keep them down. They care too much about it.
They do.
That's the big thing.
I think that's part of the situation this year is they care so much about it that sometimes they made moves and tried to make moves out of desperation.
Yeah, frustration.
And you can't do that at this level. You have to be prepared for the moves ahead of time.
It's a learning process, and Komets fans, they want a championship every year, and they've kind of come to expect it, but it just isn't feasible maybe next season. All right, he's Blake. I'm Glenn. We'll see you next week.